Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to find out what people ate for breakfast 2,000 years ago, and more importantly, we're going to understand why they managed to eat once in the morning and survived perfectly fine until the sun went down. Before we dive deep into this, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if what I do here keeps you coming back. And drop a comment letting me know where you're joining us from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing those connections from all around the world. Now, whenever you're comfortable, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some gentle background noise, and let's ease into this together. Because what you think you know about Roman breakfast is probably completely wrong. Let's start with the biggest myth of all, the one that's been fed to us by movies, television, and frankly, lazy storytelling for decades. You've seen it. The Roman gets up, maybe stretches, walks over to a simple wooden table, and someone hands him a piece of dry bread and pours him a cup of water. He'd chews miserably. This is breakfast. He's ready to build an aqueduct. This image is everywhere. It's in the background of historical dramas. It's in cartoons. It's in our collective imagination. And it's almost entirely nonsense. The kind of nonsense that would have made an actual Roman citizen in 100 BC laugh so hard that he would have spilled his carefully prepared morning meal all over his carefully cleaned floor. Why is this wrong? Because the Romans weren't surviving on bread and water. They were thriving on a combination of grains, proteins, and flavor combinations that were specifically designed to keep a human being functioning at peak capacity for an entire day of hard physical labor, administrative work, legal disputes, or military training. They understood, in a way that modern science is just beginning to clearly articulate, that what you eat in the morning sets the entire rhythm of your day. But Roman breakfast wasn't designed for comfort. It wasn't designed for pleasure. It was designed for fuel. Efficient, long-burning, hard-working fuel. And that tells you everything you need to know about how they saw the world and their place in it. Your day began early. And when I say early, I mean genuinely, brutally early. We're talking about a time before electricity, when natural light dictated every single thing you did. The sun came up, and you got up. There wasn't a snooze button. There wasn't groaning and rolling over. There was the lightening of the sky, and the immediate necessity of getting your body moving. For a Roman, the first meal of the day was called the ientaculum. That's our starting point, the ientaculum. It sounds formal, maybe even a little elegant in Latin. But don't let the language fool you. This wasn't a drawn-out, leisurely event. It was quick. It was efficient. It was practical. You had things to do, and the window for eating was narrow, usually confined to the hour or so after you woke up. If you were rich, your slave would have already been up, preparing things. If you were poor, you were up before anyone else in your family, getting the fire going, warming up whatever was left from the night before, or quickly preparing something simple and filling. This wasn't a time for elaborate cooking. This was a time for eating something that wouldn't let you down 6 hours later when you were hauling stones for a new temple or standing in the forum listening to someone argue about property lines. Efficiency wasn't just a preference, it was a survival mechanism in a society that demanded constant physical and mental output from dawn until dusk. Let's talk about social class, because if you think your social status doesn't matter in ancient Rome, you are deeply and profoundly mistaken. Your class determined every single thing about your life, down to the bread that you ate and the way you chewed it. If you were a wealthy patrician, your breakfast was a demonstration of your family's wealth, stability, and power. You could afford variety. You had access to fresher ingredients, more expensive imports, and the labor necessary to prepare them. If you were a plebeian, a common citizen, your breakfast was about bulk, calories, and getting the most energy for the least amount of money and time. And if you were a slave, your breakfast was whatever your owner decided you deserved, which was usually just enough to keep you working and not a calorie more. The patrician, the wealthy Roman, might start his day with bread, yes, but not dry bread and water. We're talking about bread that had been baked fresh, maybe with honey mixed into the dough, or topped with a soft cheese, drizzled with olive oil, and accompanied by something to drink that was a little more sophisticated than plain water. But even the patrician wasn't sitting down to a massive spread. The truly heavy eating was reserved for the *cena, the main meal that happened later in the afternoon or early evening. For now, it was a strategic intake of high-quality fuel. The plebeian, the working man, the builder, the farmer, the shopkeeper, looked at breakfast very differently. His ientaculum was built around one thing: a grain porridge called pulse. This wasn't the sweet, milky oatmeal you might be picturing. This was a thick, dense, almost paste-like substance made from spelt or emmer wheat, cooked slowly in water with maybe a little salt. If he was lucky, he had some olive oil to drizzle on top, or a few scraps of cheese, or a piece of fruit that was starting to get a little soft. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. One bowl of properly prepared pulse, eaten slowly, could power you through a morning of back-breaking labor without a single thought of food until well past noon. It was cheap, unbelievably filling, and available to almost everyone. Now let's complicate things further. Let's talk about geography and seasons, because ancient Rome was not a single place, and it wasn't a single time. Rome was an empire that stretched from the rainy, cold hills of northern Britain all the way to the blistering hot deserts of Egypt and Syria. The breakfast you ate in a small village in Gaul was dramatically different from the breakfast you ate in the city of Rome itself. And that breakfast changed again if you were stationed on the cold, windy border of Germania, or if you were living in the cosmopolitan, trade-heavy city of Alexandria. A Roman soldier posted to a fort along Hadrian's Wall in the middle of winter was eating for warmth and endurance. His breakfast was likely a thick, hot porridge made from whatever grain was available, probably barley because it was hardy and grew well in colder climates. He might have crumbled hard, salted meat into it, the kind that could last for months without spoiling. He would have wanted fat. Lots of fat. Fat from lard, fat from preserved meats, fat to create a layer of insulation against the brutal northern winds. He would have drunk something warm if he could manage it, maybe water mixed with a little sour wine to cut the taste and kill off whatever was living in it. But that same man, if he was transferred to a posting in Egypt, would find his entire diet change. The grain might be different, maybe more wheat than barley. Instead of preserved meats, he might have access to fresh fish from the Nile, or legumes that grew well in the fertile soil. The need for heavy fats would have been replaced by a need for foods that wouldn't weigh you down in the oppressive heat. Breakfast in Egypt was lighter, maybe bread with some onions, some cheese, and fruit. The same empire, but two completely different approaches to the most important meal of the day, driven by climate and local resources. And then there were the seasons. In the winter, Romans craved warm, heavy, calorie-dense foods that would raise their body temperature and provide long-term energy. The ientaculum asterisk in January was a serious business. It was about survival against the cold, which could be particularly biting in the Italian peninsula, and dangerous in the northern provinces. During the summer, things shifted. The ientaculum asterisk might be lighter, cooler, faster. Maybe some bread dipped in wine, some cheese, a handful of olives or fresh fruit that was in season. The goal was the same, to get through to the main meal, but the methods had to change to accommodate the blistering Mediterranean heat. So, when did all this happen? Timing was everything, and it was brutal. You didn't linger over breakfast. You ate, you got moving. A typical day for a Roman citizen, even a wealthy one, started before sunrise. You would wake up, wash quickly with cold water, a ritual we'll discuss in more detail later, and then eat your asterisk ientaculum. The entire process, from waking up to walking out the door, might take an hour. 90 minutes, tops. The sun was up, and so were you. The forum was already buzzing. Shops were opening. The business of the day was beginning, and Rome didn't wait for anyone. This tight schedule tells us something important about Roman society. They were a people obsessed with order, with the efficient use of time. Wasting daylight was a sin against productivity. Your breakfast wasn't a social event. It wasn't a family gathering where everyone sat around a table and discussed their plans for the day. It was a pit stop for fuel. It was a biological necessity that you satisfied before moving on to the real business of being a Roman citizen: public life, work, politics, legal matters, religious observances, and military duties. This brings us to the most interesting part of the story: the proof. What do we actually know, and how do we know it? How can we be so sure that the dry bread and water myth is wrong? We have three main sources of information. First, we have the writings. Roman authors, poets, and playwrights wrote extensively about food, about daily life, and about social customs. Second, we have archaeology. We've dug up the remains of Roman towns, houses, and military camps, and we've found the physical evidence of what they ate. Third, and perhaps most importantly, we have experimental archaeology and modern nutritional science, which can help us understand why they ate the way they did. Writers like Cato the Elder, one of the most conservative and straight-talking Romans who ever lived, wrote detailed descriptions of farming and cooking. He tells us exactly how to make pulls. He gives us recipes. He tells us what to feed slaves, what to feed soldiers, what to feed your family. He's not giving us poetry. He's giving us a practical manual for running a farm, and breakfast is a central part of that manual. From Cato, we know that the simplest, most basic form of asterisk pulls was made by roasting spelt, grinding it into a coarse flour, and then cooking it slowly with water until it reached a thick, porridge-like consistency. Simple, but effective. There was also Apicius, who lived during the reign of Tiberius, around the 1st century AD. He wrote a cookbook filled with recipes for the wealthy. Reading Apicius is like looking at the menu for the most extravagant restaurant you can imagine. Honey-sweetened bread, cheeses imported from all over the empire, eggs prepared in dozens of different ways, sausages, preserved meats, fruits, and vegetables that were almost impossible to find. Apicius shows us the absolute peak of Roman culinary achievement. This wasn't everyday eating for most people, but it shows us what was possible, what the Romans valued, and how far they were willing to go to achieve culinary excellence. And yes, even Apicius had breakfast recipes, because even the wealthy needed to start their day with food that would keep them focused through long, complicated political debates. The poet Martial, who lived in the 1st century AD, was the great observer of Roman street life. He wrote short, sharp, often hilarious poems about the people he saw every day. He wrote about the barber who served bad wine, the lawyer who was always in debt, the baker who woke up before everyone else to make bread. In his poems, we catch glimpses of what ordinary people were actually eating. We hear about people buying hot food from street vendors in the early morning, about the smell of fresh bread coming from ovens, about the simple meals of the working poor. Martial gives us the texture, the smell, the sound of a Roman morning. He makes it real. And then we have Pliny the Elder, a man who seemed to think it was his personal mission to write down everything that was known about everything. He wrote a massive, multi-volume work called Natural History, which is basically an encyclopedia of the entire Roman world. Plants, animals, minerals, people, customs, medicine, if it existed, Pliny wrote about it. And he wrote extensively about food. He tells us which grains grow best in which regions, which foods were considered healthy, which were dangerous, how to preserve them, how to cook them. Reading Pliny is like taking a masterclass in the Roman world, from the perspective of someone who was endlessly, exhaustively curious. But words can only tell us so much. For the physical proof, we have to look to archaeology. When Pompeii was buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, it froze the city in time, preserving a snapshot of Roman daily life that is absolutely unparalleled. Archaeologists have unearthed bakeries with their ovens still full of charred bread, which gives us a perfect sense of the scale and importance of bread making in the Roman world. We've found carbonized food, preserved under layers of ash and volcanic rock. We've found walnuts, figs, dates, chickpeas, eggs, even loaves of bread that look almost exactly like the bread you can buy in a modern Italian bakery. More importantly, archaeologists have studied the contents of Roman sewers and cesspits. This sounds disgusting, but it's a goldmine of information. When you dig through ancient garbage, you find the seeds, the bones, the shells, the parts of food that people didn't eat. And from that, you can reconstruct an entire diet. In one Roman military fort in Britain, for example, archaeologists found tons of oyster shells. This tells us that soldiers on the very edge of the empire, in a cold and rainy outpost, were regularly eating oysters for breakfast or as part of their meals. This means a massive, continent-spanning supply chain was bringing fresh seafood from the coast of Gaul all the way to the north of England. It's astounding. And from the sewers of Herculaneum, another city destroyed by Vesuvius, we've found evidence of a truly varied diet. Seeds from various fruits and vegetables, fish bones from different kinds of sea creatures, the remains of different types of nuts. This tells us that even ordinary people, living in crowded apartments in a medium-sized Roman town, had access to a surprisingly diverse range of foods. It wasn't just bread and water. It was a complex, sophisticated, and carefully managed food system designed to keep a massive empire running. So, let's pause for a moment and think about the implications of all this evidence. The Romans weren't just eating whatever they could find. They weren't living in some primitive, food-scarce dark age. They were engineers, administrators, farmers, and traders on a scale that the world had never seen. They understood logistics. They understood agriculture. They understood nutrition, even if they didn't have the modern scientific language for it. They knew through thousands of years of trial and error that a man carrying a 60-pound pack and a sword for 20 miles a day needed something more substantial than a piece of stale bread and a cup of tepid water. The ientaculum asterisk was the product of a society that had figured out how to feed millions of people across 3 continents. It was a result of incredible agricultural innovation, complex trade networks, and a profound, almost obsessive understanding of what the human body needed to function at its best. They developed grain varieties that were resistant to drought and disease. They built massive ships and warehouses for storage. They established a market economy that allowed a farmer in Syria to sell his grain to a merchant in Rome, who could then sell it to a baker who could make bread for a soldier who was about to march into Gaul. It was a system, a brilliant, brutal, and breathtakingly efficient system. This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. What was breakfast not? Because understanding what the Romans avoided is just as important as understanding what they ate. The Romans did not have coffee. Let that sink in for a moment. The entire Roman Empire, with all its engineering marvels, its military might, its legal brilliance, was built without a single cup of coffee. They didn't have tea. They didn't have sugar in the way we understand it. They didn't have orange juice, or bacon and eggs in the modern sense. Their mornings were fueled by entirely different chemical combinations. What they did have was wine. And while that might sound shocking to modern ears, Romans drank wine like we drink water. They watered it down, usually 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water, and they drank it throughout the day, starting with breakfast. For them, it was safer than drinking water from a public fountain that might be contaminated. It had calories. It had a little bit of alcohol, which could take the edge off the morning chill and maybe make a day of manual labor a little more bearable. To a Roman, starting the day with wine wasn't decadent. It was practical. They also didn't have the concept of breakfast foods as a separate category. There was no special food that was only eaten in the morning. You ate what was available, what was seasonal, what was affordable, and what kept you full. If you had leftover meat from the cena the night before, you might eat it for breakfast. If you had fruit that was about to go bad, you ate it. If all you had was a bowl of porridge and some olive oil, that was your breakfast. The idea of a special menu just for the morning meal is a much later invention. The reality of the Roman breakfast was, like everything else in Roman society, intensely practical, socially stratified, geographically diverse, and deeply rooted in an understanding of the human body and its needs. It wasn't about pleasure, although for the wealthy it could be immensely pleasurable. It wasn't about comfort, although a hot bowl of porridge on a cold morning was surely comforting. It was about function. The ientaculum asterisk was the first step in a daily routine that built an empire that lasted for 1,000 years. It was the spark that lit the engine of Roman civilization, every single morning, for centuries. And if we want to understand them, we have to start right there, at the beginning of their day, with the food they chose to put into their bodies before they went out and conquered the world. So, let's leave the myths behind, and let's step into the actual, tangible, surprisingly complex world of what the Romans really ate for breakfast. We're going to look at the ingredients, the preparations, the flavors, and the science that made it all work. And we're going to discover what it actually took to eat once in the morning and not feel a single pang of hunger until the main meal, the grand event of the day, the cena. So, let's move into the heart of the Roman morning, into the very engine of their empire, and talk about the single most important thing they put into their bodies each day. We're leaving behind the bread and water myth and stepping into the real world, the world of grains. And not just any grains. We're talking about the specific, carefully selected, brutally effective grains that the Romans cultivated, cooked, and consumed with an almost religious devotion. Because when a civilization decides to focus its collective energy on feeding millions of people across 3 continents, they get very, very good at it. They become, in a way that's almost impossible for us to comprehend, artists of efficiency. The star of the show, the undisputed champion of the Roman breakfast, was something called pulse. Forget everything you know about porridge. Forget the sweet, milky, cinnamon-sprinkled oatmeal you might be imagining. Pulse was something else entirely. It was serious. It was dense. It was, for most Romans, the foundation of existence. If you were a citizen, a soldier, a slave, or a senator, chances are you started your day with a bowl of pulse. It was the great leveler, the common denominator of the Roman world. From the muddy streets of a frontier town in Gaul to the marble halls of a villa on the Bay of Naples, pulse was there. So, what was it? At its most basic, pulse was a porridge made from a specific kind of wheat called spelt, or far in Latin. This isn't the wheat we use for most of our bread today. Modern bread wheat is soft and starchy. Spelt is different. It's an ancient grain, a hulled wheat, which means it has a tough outer husk that has to be removed before you can eat it. It's hardier than modern wheat, more resistant to disease, and it has a nutty, slightly sweet flavor. It's also packed with protein and fiber. For the Romans, spelt wasn't a trendy health food. It was life itself. The process of turning hard, dry spelt kernels into a warm, comforting bowl of breakfast porridge was simple, but it required knowledge and patience. First, you had to prepare the grain. You couldn't just grind it into flour like modern wheat. The husk had to be dealt with. The most common method was to toast the whole grains in a dry pan over a fire. This served 2 purposes. It dried the grain out completely, which was essential for long-term storage in a world without refrigeration, and it made the husks brittle and easy to remove. You could then pound the toasted grains in a mortar with a pestle, which would crack the husks and allow you to winnow them away by tossing the mixture in the air. The lighter husks would blow away, leaving you with the heavier, nutritious kernels. Once you had your cleaned, toasted spelt, you could grind it. But this grinding wasn't about creating a fine, fluffy flour. The Roman goal was to create a coarse, gritty meal, something with texture and substance. They used heavy stone mills, turned by hand, by animals, or by slaves. The resulting product was somewhere between modern polenta and whole wheat flour, full of fiber, full of body. And from this meal, you made pulls. You would take a pot, fill it with water, bring it to a boil over your cooking fire, and then slowly stir in the spelt meal. A Roman cook knew that you couldn't just dump it all in at once. That would create lumps, and lumpy pulls was the sign of a lazy, incompetent cook. No, you added it gradually, stirring constantly with a long wooden spoon, until the mixture began to thicken. Then you would lower the heat, cover the pot, and let it simmer. And you would let it simmer for a long time. An hour wasn't unusual. 2 hours was better. You were aiming for something that was incredibly thick, so thick that a spoon could almost stand up in it on its own. This wasn't fast food. This was slow, deliberate cooking that broke down the complex starches in the spelt, making them easier for your body to digest and converting them into long-burning, sustainable energy. When it was done, you had a bowl of beige, thick, utterly unglamorous food. But that bowl of pulls was a masterpiece of nutritional engineering. It was full of complex carbohydrates for energy, protein for muscle repair, and a huge amount of fiber that would sit in your stomach, slowly breaking down and releasing its energy over a period of many, many hours. No Roman ate pulls plain. That would have been barbaric. You added things to it. This is where social class came back into play with a vengeance. For the average Roman citizen, the plebeian, the farmer, you added what was cheap and available. A drizzle of olive oil was the most common addition. Olive oil was liquid gold in the Roman world, used for everything from cooking to lighting lamps to cleaning your skin. A good, strong, peppery olive oil poured over the top of a hot bowl of pulls added fat, flavor, and a crucial layer of calories that would keep you going. If you were feeling a little more prosperous, you might crumble some cheese into the mix. Roman cheese was often hard, salty, and sharp, similar to modern-day Pecorino Romano. A little bit of that salty cheese melted into the hot porridge added protein, fat, and a powerful flavor boost. Another common addition was a splash of vinegar or a spoonful of something called garum. We'll get into garum later, but for now, just know it was a fermented fish sauce, a staple of Roman cuisine that added a salty, savory, umami-packed punch to anything it touched. A little garum in your pulls could transform it from a bland mush into a seriously flavorful meal. For the wealthy, pulls could be elevated to an art form. We know this from the cookbook of Apicius, that guide to extravagant living. He describes a dish he calls pultes Juliae or Julian porridge, a recipe attributed to one of the Julii family. This was not your average breakfast. You started with the finest spelt, ground to a slightly finer consistency. Then, instead of just water, you cooked it in a rich meat broth. As it simmered, you added chopped oysters, mussels, and pieces of cooked fish. When it was nearly done, you stirred in crushed pine nuts for texture and a luxurious richness. This was seasoned not just with salt, but with pepper imported from India, and a complex blend of herbs. When it was served, it was finished not with plain olive oil, but with the finest, first-pressed oil, drizzled over the top in a decorative pattern. This was pulse for the 1%, a dish that was still, at its heart, simple porridge, but transformed by wealth and skill into something that belonged in a palace. Spelt wasn't the only grain in town, of course. The Roman Empire was vast, and different grains grew better in different places. In the colder, wetter climates of northern Europe, like Britain and Gaul, barley was often the grain of choice. Barley is even hardier than spelt. It can grow in poorer soil and withstand harsher weather. It was considered a coarser, less refined grain, the food of the poor and of animals. But it was also the food of the legions. When you're feeding an army of 30,000 men camped in a muddy field in Germania, you're not going to be picky about elegance. You're going to choose the grain that is most reliable, grows in the largest quantities, and provides the most calories for the least cost. Barley was the perfect soldier's grain. Barley pulse was made in much the same way as spelt pulse, but it had a different character. It was earthier, chewier, and it had a natural stickiness that made it even more filling than spelt. Soldiers would eat it with their daily ration of salted pork or bacon, crumbling the fatty meat into the hot porridge and letting the fat melt through. This was a meal designed for pure physical labor. It was about calories, fat, and salt. The three things you need to keep a man marching 20 miles a day with a heavy pack on his back. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't elegant, but it worked. Then there was emmer wheat, or triticum dicocum. Emmer is another ancient, hulled wheat, very similar to spelt. In fact, for a long time, historians and archaeologists used the terms almost interchangeably. Emmer was probably the most ancient of the Roman wheats, the grain that the earliest Romans brought with them as they expanded from their small hilltop villages to conquer the Italian peninsula. It was tougher and more primitive than spelt, and over time, as the Romans expanded and gained access to better agricultural land, spelt became more popular for everyday use. But emmer never disappeared completely. It remained an important grain, often used for religious purposes and for making a specific kind of bread. The Romans were masters of grain storage, which is a boring but absolutely essential skill for building an empire. When you're trying to feed 1 million people in the city of Rome, most of whom don't grow their own food, you need a supply chain and storage system that defies belief. And the Romans delivered. They built massive granaries called horia asterisk that were engineering marvels. These weren't just big sheds. They were designed to keep grain dry, cool, and safe from pests. The floors were often raised on pillars to allow air to circulate underneath, preventing moisture. The walls were thick, sometimes double-walled, to insulate the grain from the heat of the Italian summer. Storage was just as important for the individual household. For a farmer, a good harvest meant you had enough grain to feed your family until the next harvest, which could be over a year away. You couldn't just dump it in a pile in the corner of your hut. You had to protect it. You stored it in large clay jars, sealed with wax or pitch to keep out air and insects. You kept it in a cool, dry part of your house. If you were wealthy, you might have a dedicated storage room with raised floors and ventilation shafts. The entire economic and social stability of the Roman world rested on the ability to store grain successfully for months, or even years. A failed harvest, or a failure in the storage system, could mean famine, riots, and political instability. The economics of grain are fascinating because they reveal the brutal, mathematical logic behind the Roman state. The government understood that happy citizens were full citizens. An empty stomach was a revolutionary's first weapon. So, the state took a direct interest in the grain supply. In the city of Rome, there was a system called the annona, which was a state-sponsored grain dole. The government would buy vast quantities of grain, mostly from Egypt, which was the breadbasket of the empire, and then distribute it, either for free or at a heavily subsidized price, to the citizens of Rome. This was a form of social welfare, but it was also a form of control. By providing the basic food staple, the government kept the urban poor from rioting. It ensured that the massive, non-agricultural population of Rome stayed fed, and therefore, stayed quiet. This system had a huge impact on the daily life of a Roman citizen in the capital. It meant that even if you were poor, you could be relatively certain of getting your daily ration of grain. You might not have money for expensive meats or imported luxuries, but you would have your bread, or the wheat to make your pulse. This security was the glue that held Roman society together. It allowed for the emergence of a large class of urban poor who didn't farm, who instead worked in trades, as laborers, or who were simply supported by the state. It enabled the massive public works projects that required thousands of workers. It allowed for the creation of a standing army, because a soldier knew his family back in Rome would not starve while he was on campaign. Let's get down to the actual recipes and cooking innovations, because the Romans weren't just boiling grain in water. They had techniques, methods, and recipes that they had perfected over centuries of trial and error. One of the most interesting developments was the concept of pre-cooked grain. We have evidence that Roman soldiers and travelers would carry with them a kind of instant food. It was called alica, and it was made by partially cooking spelt or emmer wheat, then drying it in the sun or in an oven until it was rock hard. This dried, par-cooked grain was lightweight, non-perishable, and incredibly portable. When you were on the march, all you had to do was boil some water, add a handful of alica, and within minutes you had a hot, filling meal that required almost no preparation. It was the Roman equivalent of instant oatmeal, proof that they understood the need for convenience food long before the modern era. Another common cooking method was to bake the pulse instead of simmering it on the stovetop. You would make the porridge as usual, thicken it up, and then pour it into a shallow pan and bake it in an oven until it was firm, almost like a dense, savory cake. This was called placenta, and it could be eaten hot or cold, sliced into squares. It was easy to transport, and it would last for several days without spoiling. A soldier could carry a few squares of baked placenta in his pack, and it would provide him with a solid, sustaining meal whenever he needed it. The innovation didn't stop with the cooking. It extended to the processing. The Romans developed different grades of flour and meal. For the finest bread, you wanted the whitest flour, which meant removing the bran and germ from the wheat kernel. This was a laborious process involving multiple grindings and siftings, and it was very expensive. The result was snow-white bread that was a status symbol for the wealthy. For everyday use, you used a darker, more whole-grain flour. For pulls, you used the coarsest meal, the stuff that still contained all the fiber and most of the nutrition. The Romans weren't trying to make their porridge light and fluffy. They were trying to make it heavy, dense, and filling. They wanted the weight of it in their stomachs. They wanted to feel full, and they wanted that feeling to last. The sheer variety and sophistication of Roman grain cookery tells us a lot about their culture. This wasn't a society that was just scraping by. This was a society that had mastered its food supply. They knew how to grow it, how to transport it, how to store it, and how to cook it in dozens of different ways to maximize its nutritional value and its flavor. They turned the simple act of making breakfast into a science. And when you start to look at the macronutritional profile of a good Roman breakfast, you begin to understand why they were able to eat once in the morning and work until evening without a problem. A typical bowl of pulls, made with about 100 grams of spelt meal and topped with a good drizzle of olive oil, would contain around 350 to 400 calories. It would be about 70% complex carbohydrates, 15% protein, and 15% fat. The carbohydrates were the slow-burning kind, the kind that released their energy over a period of several hours. The protein would help maintain muscle mass and keep you feeling full. The fat, especially the healthy fats from the olive oil, provided an extra layer of satiety and helped your body absorb fat-soluble vitamins. But the real secret, the thing that modern nutritionists are just beginning to fully appreciate, was the fiber. A single serving of pulls contained a massive amount of dietary fiber. This fiber did two things. First, it slowed down the digestion of the carbohydrates even more, preventing the spike and crash in blood sugar that you get from eating modern, refined breakfast cereals. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it created a physical mass in your stomach and intestines. It made you feel physically full, not just chemically satisfied. This feeling of fullness, of having a solid meal sitting in your gut, was a powerful appetite suppressant. It told your brain, on a purely physical level, that you were not hungry. And that feeling could last for hours. This is the key to understanding the Roman breakfast. It wasn't just about calories. It was about strategic fullness. The Romans had, through thousands of years of experimentation, developed a meal system that perfectly balanced immediate energy needs with long-term satiety. They understood, in a visceral, practical way, that a light, sugary breakfast would leave you hungry and weak by mid-morning. They knew that a heavy, protein and fat-based meal would sit in your stomach like a rock and might make you sluggish. But they discovered that a meal based on coarse, fibrous grains, with a moderate amount of protein and a little bit of healthy fat, was the perfect combination. It gave you a steady stream of energy, it prevented hunger pangs, and it didn't weigh you down. It was the perfect fuel for the relentless, demanding lifestyle of the Roman world. Now we come to the part of the Roman breakfast that often gets left out of the story, the secret ingredient that transformed a bowl of grain porridge from simply filling to genuinely sustaining. We've covered the carbohydrates. We know about the asterisk poles. But a civilization doesn't build aqueducts and conquer continents on carbohydrates alone. You need protein. Raw, powerful, efficient protein that rebuilds muscle, keeps your mind sharp, and provides the long-burning fat that turns a morning meal into a day-long source of energy. The Romans understood this instinctively. They didn't have the scientific language of amino acids and essential fatty acids, but they had centuries of experience watching what happened to the human body when you fed it the right things. They knew that a man who ate only porridge would fade by noon. But a man who ate porridge with cheese or eggs, or a scrap of salted meat, that man could work like a machine from sunrise to sunset. Let's start with cheese, because cheese was the protein of the people, the democratic fuel that was available to almost everyone, everywhere in the empire. You didn't need vast estates or a fortune to keep a few goats or sheep. Even the poorest farmer could manage a small flock, and from that flock, you got milk. But milk is perishable. It goes bad in a matter of days, even hours, in the warm Mediterranean climate. Cheese, however, is milk's greatest trick. It's milk that has been coaxed into a new form, one that can last for weeks, months, or even years. The Romans were masters of this transformation. When you think of Roman cheese, don't picture the soft, creamy brie or the rubbery, orange cheddar of the modern world. Roman cheese was, for the most part, hard, salty, and sharp. It was designed for survival, not for subtlety. The most common method of making it was simple. You would take fresh milk, warm it gently, and then add a substance called rennet to make it curdle. Rennet is an enzyme found in the stomach of young mammals, and it's what turns milk into cheese. The Romans knew how to extract and preserve it. Once the milk had separated into solid curds and liquid whey, you would strain off the whey. The curds would then be pressed into molds to squeeze out more moisture. The more moisture you removed, the harder and longer lasting the cheese became. The final step, and the one that gave Roman cheese its distinctive character, was salting. You would either press salt directly into the cheese or, more commonly, you would brine it. The cheese would be submerged in a heavily salted solution for days or weeks. This did two things. The salt acted as a powerful preservative, killing off any bacteria that might cause spoilage. And it infused the cheese with a powerful, briny flavor that could cut through the blandness of a thick porridge. The resulting cheese was incredibly dense, packed with protein and fat, and it had a shelf life that made it the perfect food for soldiers, sailors, and anyone else who needed to travel or store food for long periods. We actually have a detailed description of this process from that no-nonsense farmer, Cato the Elder. He gives a precise recipe for making cheese on a large estate, specifying the amount of milk, the amount of rennet, the pressing weights, and the salting process. He wasn't writing a cookbook for fancy dinner parties. He was writing a manual for efficient estate management. Making cheese was a core part of the agricultural calendar, a way of preserving the bounty of spring and summer for the lean months of winter. For breakfast, cheese was used as a powerful accent. You wouldn't sit down to a plate of cheese on its own. That would have been wasteful and inefficient. Instead, you would take your bowl of hot pulls, and you would grate or crumble a small amount of this hard, salty cheese over the top. As the cheese made contact with the hot porridge, it would soften and begin to melt, releasing its fat and its intense savory flavor. The sharp, salty taste would cut through the blandness of the grain, making the whole meal more palatable. And more importantly, the protein and fat from the cheese would add another layer of satiety, another slow-burning fuel source that would keep you going long after the initial burst of energy from the carbohydrates had worn off. If you were a soldier on the march, you might just eat a small chunk of the cheese by itself, chewing it slowly to release its energy over time. But cheese wasn't the only source of morning protein. There were also eggs. The Romans had a deep and abiding love for eggs in all their forms. They understood them, celebrated them, and cooked them with a creativity that puts most modern breakfasts to shame. The most common eggs were from chickens, of course, but the wealthy might also enjoy eggs from geese, ducks, or even pheasants. The poet Martial, that sharp-eyed observer of Roman life, made a simple meal of eggs, cheese, and olives sound like the height of rustic elegance. Eggs were prized for their versatility and their nutritional density. They were a complete protein source, meaning they contained all the essential amino acids the human body needs. Let's talk about how the Romans ate their eggs, because this is where things get interesting. The modern concept of frying or scrambling eggs in a pan was known, but it wasn't the most common method. The Romans didn't have non-stick pans. They cooked in heavy clay or bronze pots, which required a lot of fat to prevent sticking. A more common, and more efficient, method was to boil them. But even here, the Romans had mastered the technique. They knew the difference between a soft-boiled egg, with its runny yolk, and a hard-boiled egg, which was a portable, non-perishable snack that could be taken to the fields or the workshop. Apicius, that font of culinary extravagance, gives us recipes for eggs that would not be out of place in a modern high-end restaurant. He describes a dish called ova spongia ex lact asterisk, which translates to sponge eggs with milk. This was a kind of ancient omelette or soufflé, made by beating eggs with milk, a little honey for sweetness, and a dash of pepper, and then cooking it slowly until it was light and fluffy. He also gives a recipe for what we might call deviled eggs, where hard-boiled yolks were mixed with pine nuts, pepper, and a little garum asterisk, and then stuffed back into the whites. This was elegant, sophisticated food, a far cry from a simple boiled egg. But perhaps the most famous Roman egg dish, and one that was certainly eaten for breakfast by those who could afford it, was patina. A patina was a baked egg custard, something like a quiche without the crust. You would beat eggs together with various ingredients, maybe chopped vegetables, pieces of cooked meat or fish, cheese, herbs. Pour the mixture into a shallow dish, and bake it in an oven until it was set. It could be served hot or cold, making it a perfect make-ahead meal for a busy morning. A slice of patina, eaten with a piece of bread, was a breakfast that could power you through a morning of legal arguments or political maneuvering in the forum. It was protein-rich, filling, and versatile. For the average person, eggs were a more occasional treat. You ate them when your hens were laying well. You might boil a couple of eggs in the morning to take with you to work, eating them a few hours later when the first pangs of hunger started to set in. The protein in an egg, especially the fat-rich yolk, is incredibly satiating. It's designed by nature to nourish a developing chick, and that same dense nutrition worked perfectly for a Roman laborer who needed his energy to last. Then we come to the most complicated and controversial source of Roman protein: fish. And more specifically, fish sauce, or garum. This is where a lot of modern people get squeamish, but if you want to understand the Roman diet, you have to get comfortable with garum. It was everywhere. It was the ketchup, the soy sauce, the Worcestershire sauce of the Roman world. And a little bit of it, drizzled over your morning pulse, could change everything. Garum is a fermented fish sauce. It's made by layering small fish, like anchovies or sardines, with large amounts of salt in a large clay vessel. You would leave this mixture to ferment in the hot sun for weeks or months. The combination of salt and heat would break down the fish proteins, creating a thick, dark, incredibly flavorful liquid that would then be drained off and bottled. The smell was notoriously strong, and the taste was an intense explosion of salt and umami, the savory, fifth taste that makes food irresistible. For the Romans, garum was a flavor miracle. It added a rich, savory depth to anything it touched. A single spoonful could transform a bland bowl of porridge into a savory, delicious meal. It was the secret ingredient in hundreds of recipes. It was used as a condiment, a cooking ingredient, and even as a medicine. The best garum made from the livers of mackerel, was a luxury item that cost a small fortune. But the common variety, made from whatever small fish were available, was affordable for almost everyone. It was a powerful source of protein in a concentrated form, and its high salt content helped to replenish the electrolytes that were lost through sweat during a hard day's work. Now, let's move away from the sea and onto the land, to the protein sources that were a bit more humble but just as important. Legumes, beans, chickpeas, and lentils were the protein of the common man. They were cheap, they were easy to grow, and they were incredibly nutritious. A bowl of lentil soup or a mash of fava beans could be a breakfast in itself, or a side dish to your pulse. Legumes are packed with protein and fiber, another one of those magical combinations that the Romans understood intuitively. The protein gives you a long-lasting energy source, and the fiber ensures that you feel full for hours. Nuts were another important, though often overlooked, source of protein and fat. Almonds, walnuts, chestnuts, and pine nuts were all popular. They were expensive, but for those who could afford them, a handful of nuts added to your morning meal was an excellent way to boost your energy. Nuts are calorie-dense and full of healthy fats and protein. They're also the perfect portable food, easy to carry and eat on the go. A Roman heading out for a long day might slip a handful of almonds or walnuts into his pouch, a quick and efficient snack for when he needed a burst of energy. What about meat? This is a tricky question. The idea of a big breakfast with bacon and sausages is a very modern, very Northern European concept. In the Roman world, meat was expensive, it was difficult to preserve, and it was associated with the main meal, the cena. But that doesn't mean meat was absent from the breakfast table. It just appeared in different forms. The wealthy might have leftover roasted meats from the night before, served cold and sliced thin. The plebeian might have a scrap of salted or smoked meat to flavor his porridge. For the Roman army, preserved meat was a vital part of the diet, and that included breakfast. The most common form was salted pork. The legions consumed staggering quantities of pork. They would take cuts of pork, pack them in salt, and let them cure for months. The result was incredibly tough, incredibly salty meat that would last for years without spoiling. In the morning, a soldier might take a chunk of this hard, salty pork, chop it up, and either eat it on the side or, more likely, crumble it into his hot barley pulse. The fat from the pork would melt into the porridge, adding flavor, calories, and a massive dose of salt that would be crucial for a man about to spend the day marching in the sun. It was a brutal, effective, and utterly practical way to start the day. The salsum asterisk, or salted meat, wasn't the only option. There was also bacon, which the Romans made by salting and smoking the belly of the pig. And there were sausages, a food that the Romans loved and made in dozens of different varieties. A sausage could be made from pork, beef, or even blood, mixed with herbs and spices, stuffed into a casing, and then smoked or cured. A piece of sausage with your morning bread was a fast, high-protein start to the day. For the very wealthy, the patrician class who lived a life of almost unimaginable luxury, breakfast could be an opportunity to display their access to the exotic. They might have sausages made from imported spices, or a slice of smoked goose or duck. They might have had access to dormice, which were considered a delicacy. These were raised in special jars, fed on acorns and chestnuts, and then fattened up for the table. A roasted dormouse was a tiny, rich, fatty morsel, a treat that demonstrated your refined palate and your ability to afford the truly unusual. This contrast in protein sources, from the hard cheese of the peasant to the smoked goose of the patrician, highlights the social stratification of Roman society. But what's fascinating is that, at a nutritional level, they were all trying to achieve the same thing. The patrician with his elegant patina and the soldier with his pork-laden barley porridge were both seeking to maximize their protein, fat, and salt intake in the morning to ensure they had the physical and mental stamina to perform their duties. The quality and sophistication of the source might have been different, but the fundamental goal was identical: strategic fuel. Let's use two examples from opposite ends of the Roman world to illustrate this. First, let's imagine a centurion, a senior officer in the legions, stationed on the Rhine frontier in Germania. It's a cold, wet morning. He wakes up in his tent and his servant brings him his breakfast. It consists of a large bowl of hot barley pulse, thickened to the point where it's almost solid. On top is a generous drizzle of olive oil and a chunk of hard, salty goat cheese that has begun to melt into the hot porridge. On the side, he has a piece of hard, unleavened bread and a cup of sour wine mixed with water. The meal is heavy, warming, and packed with a slow-burning combination of complex carbohydrates, protein, and fat that will keep him warm and alert through a long day of training exercises and border patrols. It's not elegant, but it's brutally effective. Now, let's transport ourselves to a villa on the Bay of Naples. home of a wealthy Roman senator who is taking a break from the politics of the capital. He wakes up later, perhaps an hour or two after sunrise. His breakfast is brought to him on a silver tray. There is a small loaf of fine white bread, still warm from the oven. Next to it is a small bowl of soft cheese and a dish of olives. The centerpiece is a portion of baked patina, made with eggs, cream, and pieces of smoked fish, lightly seasoned with pepper. He drinks well-watered wine from a polished silver cup. This meal is lighter, more refined, but it is still strategically designed. The protein from the eggs and cheese, combined with the fat from the dairy and olive oil, will provide a steady, sophisticated source of energy that will allow him to focus on reading, dictating letters to his secretary, and planning his political moves for the day, all without the distraction of hunger. Both men, the soldier and the senator, have eaten meals that are grounded in the same nutritional principles. They've both consumed a high-quality protein source that will prevent muscle breakdown and provide long-lasting energy. They've both eaten fat that will slow the digestion of their meal and create a feeling of fullness that will last for hours. And they've both consumed salt and other minerals that will be lost throughout the day. The execution is different, dictated by social class and available resources, but the underlying strategy is identical. This is how the Romans fueled their ambition, their labor, and their empire, one powerful, protein-packed breakfast at a time. We've talked about the heavy, substantial parts of the Roman breakfast, the groundbreaking pulls, the powerful proteins, the parts that provided the structural integrity, the long-burning fuel that kept an empire running. But a civilization doesn't survive on fuel alone. An empire is built by human beings, and human beings are complicated creatures who crave pleasure, who need stimulation, who need flavor. The Romans, for all their reputation for discipline and order, were sensory hedonists. They loved beauty, they loved luxury, they loved intense, complex experiences. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the way they approached flavor. The Roman palate was not timid. It was not balanced or subtle in the way we might think of it today. The Roman palate was a battleground of extremes. It was a world of shocking sweetness, brutal saltiness, and sour, vinegary bites that could make your jaw clench. It was a whiplash of tastes that no modern cuisine can truly prepare you for. Let's start with sweetness. This is the most jarring difference for a modern person trying to understand the Roman world. They didn't have sugar, not in the way we know it. The crystalline, pure, white sugar that we take for granted was completely unknown to them. The sugarcane plant was known in India and Persia, and the Romans had heard of it. They called it honey in reed form, a poetic description from a people who understood what it was but couldn't grow it themselves. The climate was wrong, so they had to find their sweetness in other places, and the primary source, the absolute king of all Roman sweeteners, was honey. Honey wasn't a luxury item. It was a necessity. It was the gasoline that fueled the Roman sweet tooth. The Roman Empire had a massive beekeeping industry. Hives were kept on farms, in gardens, on the roofs of houses. The methods were sophisticated. They used clay hives, which they could carefully manage. They understood the life cycle of the bee. They knew how to encourage colonies to produce more honey. And they harvested it on a scale that boggles the mind. Cato the Elder gives detailed instructions for making a sweet honey wine called mulsum asterisk, and the quantities involved tell you everything you need to know about their love for the stuff. A single large estate might produce thousands of pounds of honey in a season. But honey for the Romans wasn't just the golden, sweet, mellow honey we think of today. It was a complex substance with a range of flavors. Honey made from bees that foraged on chestnut trees was dark, bitter, and intense. Honey made from thyme was aromatic and sharp. Honey made in the mountains had a different character from honey made near the sea. The Romans were connoisseurs of these subtle differences, and like wine, the best honey was a status symbol, imported from the far corners of the empire, from Sicily, from Spain, from Crete. It was a precious commodity, protected by law, and used with a reverence that bordered on the religious. They knew it was a gift from the gods. So, how did this intense sweetness manifest at the breakfast table? For the plebeian, it was a simple addition. A single spoonful of honey drizzled over a bowl of hot pulse could transform a utilitarian meal into a treat. Honey spread on a piece of coarse bread was a simple, effective way to start the day with a burst of energy. For the wealthy, honey was an ingredient in more complex preparations. It was used in sweetened breads, in cakes, in pastries that were a specialty of Roman bakers. But perhaps the most common use in the morning was in drinks. Honey was mixed with water to create a simple, refreshing drink called hydromel, a precursor to mead. It was also mixed with vinegar and water to create posca, a sour sweet drink that was incredibly popular with soldiers and the common people. It quenched thirst, provided quick energy, and covered up the taste of questionable water. This brings us to the other side of the Roman flavor spectrum: the sour, the sharp, the vinegary. If honey was the sweetheart of the Roman palate, vinegar was its acidic soul. Just like honey wasn't just one thing, Roman vinegar was a complex, multi-layered ingredient. It could be made from wine, which was the most common type, but it could also be made from beer, from fruit, or from grain. The quality varied dramatically. Cheap vinegar was harsh and acrid, good only for cleaning or preserving. But fine-aged vinegar, the kind used for cooking and at the table, was a thing of complexity and beauty, with a depth of flavor that could rival a fine wine. Vinegar was everywhere in Roman cuisine. It was used as a preservative, turning fresh vegetables into pickles that could last for months. It was used in cooking to deglaze pans and create bright, sharp sauces. And it was used as a condiment, splashed onto food at the last minute to wake up the flavors. For breakfast, a splash of vinegar on a piece of fish, in a vegetable dish, or even in your porridge was not unusual. The sourness cut through the richness of fats and oils, it stimulated the appetite, and it helped with digestion. It was the perfect counterpoint to the heavy, starchy, protein-rich components of a Roman meal. It was the bright, sharp note that prevented the meal from becoming a heavy, sleepy burden. And we cannot talk about sour flavors without mentioning fruit. Not just the sweet fruits, but the sour ones. The Romans had a particular love for the sharp, the tart, the unripe. A green apple, still sour and hard, was considered a delicacy. Quinces, which are incredibly tart unless cooked for hours with massive amounts of honey, were a common feature on the Roman table. crab apples, medlars, and various kinds of berries, many of them far more sour than their modern cultivated descendants, added a bright, mouth-puckering quality to the Roman diet. These fruits were often preserved in honey or vinegar, creating sweet-sour confections that were eaten as a digestive after meals or as a small treat during the day. They were a burst of natural, fresh sourness in a world of dried and preserved foods. But let's be honest. When we talk about the extreme, exotic, and nearly incomprehensible flavors of the Roman world, there is one ingredient that stands above all others. One ingredient that defines the Roman palate more than any other. An ingredient so strange, so potent, so pervasive that it's almost impossible to overstate its importance. I'm talking, of course, about garum asterisk. We've touched on it before, but now we need to truly understand it. Garum asterisk was a fermented fish sauce. But that simple description does not do it justice. It was the soul of Roman cooking. It was a dark, thick, viscous liquid with a smell so powerful and so alien to the modern nose that it's been compared to everything from rancid cheese to old socks mixed with anchovies and seawater. The Roman writer Seneca described it as the costly liquid of the bloody fish, and he wasn't being poetic. It was the umami bomb of the ancient world, a concentration of salt, protein, and intense savory flavor that could transform any dish. The best garum asterisk, and this is where it gets truly strange, was made in a way that seems deliberately designed to be as disgusting as possible. The Romans would take the livers and gills of mackerel or tuna, mix them with the fish's intestines and blood, add some aromatic herbs, and then pack the entire mess into a clay pot with enough salt to make it almost solid. This pot would be left out in the hot Mediterranean sun for 2 months. For 60 days, this biological slurry would sit there, fermenting, breaking down, turning into something new and incredibly potent. The resulting liquid that was drained off was a clear, amber-colored sauce that the Romans considered a work of art. It was syrupy, intensely flavored, and incredibly expensive. A single small bottle of high-quality garum asterisk could cost as much as a good horse. But you didn't need the best garum asterisk to change your breakfast. The common variety, made from whole small fish, was affordable to almost everyone. And it was used with a liberality that is shocking. A spoonful of garum asterisk stirred into your pulse would elevate it from a simple porridge to a savory, complex, deeply satisfying meal. It was drizzled over eggs, used as a dip for bread, mixed into sauces, and used as a seasoning in almost every savory dish. It was the flavor of Rome. It was the taste of empire. The question is, why? Why would a civilization become so obsessed with such a bizarre and powerful flavor? The answer lies in the nature of their diet and their understanding of what the human body needs. The Roman diet was heavy on carbohydrates. Bread, porridge, beans. These are the bland, starchy staples of the working person's diet in any agricultural society. Fatiguingly bland. Your palate gets tired of them. You need something to wake it up. You need a flavor that signals to your brain that something important and nutritious is happening. Garum asterisk did that. It was a massive dose of umami, which is the savory taste of proteins. The human brain is hardwired to seek out umami, because it's a signal that we're eating protein-rich food, which is essential for survival. Garum was a shortcut to that signal. It made bland food taste good, and it made you feel satisfied. It was a chemical cheat code for appetite stimulation. Let's talk about herbs and spices, because the Roman pantry was just as sophisticated as the modern one, if not more so. And once again, social class determined everything. If you were a wealthy patrician, your food was seasoned with a dizzying array of imported spices that spoke of your global reach and immense wealth. The single most important spice was pepper. Black pepper. But not the stale, pre-ground dust we get from a supermarket shaker. Roman pepper was a cascade of whole black peppercorns, brought by ship from the Malabar coast of India, thousands of miles away. The trade in pepper was one of the most important economic drivers of the empire. A single caravan of spices arriving in Rome could make merchants fabulously wealthy. Black pepper was followed by a whole cast of supporting spices. There was long pepper, a hotter, more complex relative of the black peppercorn. There was ginger, used fresh or dried, which added a fiery, fragrant warmth to dishes. Cumin was incredibly popular, adding its distinctive earthy flavor to cheeses, breads, and meat dishes. Coriander, fennel, saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were all known and used, though the latter were so expensive that they were reserved for the most extravagant displays of wealth. These spices weren't just for flavor. They were medicine. The Romans believed that certain foods had heating or cooling properties, and spices were seen as heating, stimulating, and essential for good digestion. A breakfast seasoned with pepper and ginger was thought to warm the body from the inside and get the digestive fires burning. If you were a plebeian, your access to these exotic spices was limited. You couldn't afford black pepper imported from India. But that doesn't mean your food was bland. You used local herbs. You grew them in small pots by your window or gathered them from the countryside. You had thyme, with its earthy, floral aroma. You had oregano, rosemary, sage, and mint. You had garlic and onions, which were used with a passion that still defines Mediterranean cooking today. You had fennel fronds and wild greens that you gathered from the fields. These local, fresh herbs provided a brightness and variety that could make a simple meal of bread and cheese seem like a feast. They were the flavor of the land, accessible to everyone. Now, let's consider the effect of all these flavors on the Roman body and mind. A Roman breakfast was not a gentle affair. It was an assault on the senses. It began with the texture, the thick, heavy, almost solid weight of the asterisk pulls in your mouth. Then the flavors hit you. The sweet punch of honey, the sharp, wake-up call of vinegar, the earthy saltiness of hard cheese, and then, the final blow, the deep, dark, almost overwhelming umami of the garum and the subtle heat of black pepper. There was no subtlety here. There was no delicate balance. It was a sensory event, a series of intense flavors that told your brain, loudly and clearly, that it was time to wake up and get to work. These flavors weren't just for pleasure. They were strategic. The combination of sweet and sour, of salty and umami, works on a deep physiological level. Sweetness provides a quick burst of energy. Sourness stimulates the production of saliva and digestive enzymes, helping to break down the heavy, starchy food. Salt replenishes electrolytes and makes everything taste better. And the deep savory flavor of meat, cheese, or garum signals to your brain that you've eaten a protein-rich meal, which generates a powerful feeling of satiety and well-being. The Romans were orchestrating a symphony of tastes and mouthfeels designed to maximize both immediate energy and long-term satisfaction. They were hacking their own biology with flavor. Roman breakfasts were designed to prevent palate fatigue, that phenomenon where a bland, monotonous diet leads you to stop eating before you've actually consumed enough calories. The intense, rotating flavors kept the experience interesting. You might have pulls with honey and cheese one day, pulls with garum and black pepper the next. A bite of egg followed by a sharp, briny olive. A piece of bread dipped in a mixture of olive oil and strong vinegar. These constant changes of flavor kept your brain engaged and your appetite stimulated, ensuring that you would consume enough of the heavy, calorie-dense food you needed to get through the day. Finally, we have to talk about the influence of empire. The Roman palate was not a static thing. It was dynamic, constantly changing as the empire expanded and came into contact with new cultures and new food sources. In the early days of the Republic, the Roman diet was simple and austere, based mostly on the grains and legumes that could be grown on the small farms of central Italy. But as they conquered Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, and the Near East, they absorbed new ingredients, new techniques, and new tastes. The influx of wealth from conquest made extravagance possible. The establishment of trade routes brought spices from India, silks from China, and exotic fruits from Africa. The Roman breakfast table became a map of their empire, a daily reminder of their global power. A patrician might start his day with bread made from wheat grown in Egypt, cheese from Gaul, olives from Spain, fruit from North Africa, and spices from India, all washed down with wine from Italy. It was a cosmopolitan, globe-spanning meal, eaten thousands of years before the word globalization was ever invented. It was the flavor of dominance, of success, of a world united by the point of a Roman sword and the insatiable appetite of its people. It was a taste that was as complex, as tough, and as enduring as the empire that created it. So we come to the real secret, the hidden engine behind the Roman breakfast. It's not just about what they ate. It's about when they ate it, how much they ate, and the brutal, unspoken social logic that governed every single bite. Because the Romans didn't just consume food. They used it. They weaponized it. Breakfast was not a democratic affair. It was a carefully balanced equation of power, social control, and physiological necessity. It was an act of social engineering, played out on plates and in stomachs every single morning, from the damp mists of the Scottish border to the blistering heat of the Syrian desert. Let's start with the structure of the Roman day, because the meal system itself was a masterclass in controlled energy distribution. Modern Western culture operates on a three-meal structure: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's a steady, reliable, predictable drumbeat of food intake designed to keep our energy levels consistent throughout a day that is largely sedentary. We eat to prevent hunger. The Romans did not share this philosophy. Their day was built around two main meals: the ientaculum, breakfast, and the cena, dinner. There might be a small snack in between, called the prandium asterisk, but it was often nothing more than a piece of bread or some leftovers, eaten on the run. It wasn't a meal. This two-meal system tells us something profound about their lifestyle. It was a rhythm designed for maximum productivity. The ientaculum asterisk was the engine start. It was a dense, heavy, but relatively quick meal designed to fire up your metabolism and load your body with enough calories and nutrients to last for 8, 10, or even 12 hours of intense physical or mental activity. There was no time for a leisurely lunch, no expectation of a midday meal break. You ate in the morning, you worked until late afternoon, and then, and only then, did you have the cena, the main event of the day, the grand, sprawling meal that could last for hours. The purpose of this structure was simple: to minimize interruptions. A society that stops for lunch is a society that loses momentum. By condensing their eating into two distinct blocks, the Romans maximized the amount of daylight available for work, for public affairs, for military training, for everything that needed to be done. It was a schedule built for a people who saw productivity as a civic and moral duty. It was a way of aligning the biological necessity of eating with the relentless demands of an empire. Now, let's look at the portion control, because this is where you really see the cold, mathematical genius of the Roman system. How much you ate for breakfast was not a matter of personal choice or appetite. It was a function of your social class, your job, and your value to the state. Let's take the Roman legionary, the professional soldier who was the sharp end of the Roman spear. His diet was not a suggestion. It was a regulation, as strict and unforgiving as the drills he performed every day. We know from military records that a legionary was issued a standard daily ration. It included a specific weight of grain, usually around 1.5 pounds, a specific measure of sour wine, *posca*, a certain amount of salted pork or bacon, and smaller amounts of cheese, vegetables, and salt. This ration wasn't given to him all at once to eat whenever he felt like it. It was distributed, and the expectation was that he would manage it, portioning it out for himself across the day. A smart soldier, one who wanted to stay strong and alert, would consume a large portion of that ration for breakfast. He might eat 2/3 of his daily grain as a thick, heavy pulse in the morning, along with a substantial portion of his meat and cheese. This massive intake of calories, carefully balanced between carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, was designed to sit in his stomach like a rock, releasing its energy slowly and steadily over the course of a long, grueling day of marching, digging, and fighting. The remaining third of his ration was saved for his cena, the meal that would refuel his body and allow him to rest and recover for the next day. This was portion control as a survival strategy, dictated from above, with zero room for error. Contrast this with the patrician, the wealthy senator or landowner. His portion control was an act of self-discipline and social signaling. While the soldier's portions were designed for brute force and endurance, the patrician's portions were designed for intellect, social agility, and aesthetic refinement. Overeating at breakfast was a sign of gluttony, a vice that was deeply frowned upon by the Roman moral code. A heavy, bloated man was considered weak, undisciplined, and untrustworthy. To be effective in the cutthroat world of Roman politics, you needed to be sharp, quick, and physically impressive. A senator might eat a light but nutritionally dense breakfast, perhaps a small baked patina of eggs and fish, a piece of fine white bread with honey, some cheese and fruit. Enough to fuel the morning's work, but not so much that it would dull the mind or make him sluggish during a crucial debate in the Senate. The portion was a statement: I am a man of discipline and self-control, and I have the strength of will to govern myself before I presume to govern others. But for the vast majority of the Roman population, the plebeians, free citizens who worked as farmers, artisans, and shopkeepers, portion control was a matter of brutal economic necessity. You ate what you could afford, and not a crumb more. A farmer might eat until he felt full in the morning because he knew that the next meal was many hours away, and the work of plowing a field or harvesting a crop was incredibly demanding. But he was also limited by what he had. You didn't eat tomorrow's food today. That was a recipe for disaster. The portion was a careful balance between immediate necessity and long-term survival, a daily calculation of need versus scarcity. It was portion control born of poverty and a deep, ancestral fear of hunger. This brings us to the psychological aspects of Roman eating, the subtle but powerful ways that food was used to control behavior and enforce social order. The massive, stomach-filling nature of the Roman breakfast was a form of psychological appeasement. A full stomach is a docile stomach. A man who has just eaten a huge bowl of pulse with cheese and oil, feeling that weight in his gut, is less likely to be agitated, less likely to be aggressive, less likely to cause trouble. It's difficult to be a revolutionary on a full stomach. The Roman state understood this at a visceral level. By ensuring that even the poorest citizens had access to the grain dole, the annona, they were engaging in a massive, city-wide program of social sedation. They were trading bread for peace, porridge for public order. The ientaculum asterisk was the first dose of social glue administered every single day. The wealthy used food for a different kind of psychological control, the display of power. The patrician breakfast wasn't just a meal, it was a performance. When a wealthy Roman received clients and dependents in the morning, a ritual known as the salutatio asterisk, it was common for him to offer them a small taste of his morning meal. This wasn't an act of kindness. It was an act of dominance. He was demonstrating his wealth, his generosity, his power to provide. He was creating a group of dependents who were psychologically bound to him by their shared experience of eating his food. It was a ritual of subordination, a daily reminder of who was the patron and who was the client. The portion was tiny, just a taste, but it carried a massive psychological weight. The military took this psychological conditioning to its absolute extreme. In the Roman army, food was discipline. The daily ration was not a reward, it was a tool. A soldier who performed well, who followed orders, who showed courage, was given his full ration. A soldier who was lazy, disobedient, or cowardly could be punished with a reduction in his rations. He might be given nothing but bread and water for days, a punishment that was as much psychological as it was physical. It was a clear, brutal message: your performance is directly tied to your food. The threat of hunger was a constant motivating force, a whip held over the head of every legionary. He was taught that food was not a right, but a privilege that had to be earned through loyalty, discipline, and absolute obedience to his centurion and to the emperor. The system was supported by a complex web of religious and cultural traditions that reinforced the official food distribution. The state religion was deeply intertwined with the agricultural and political calendars. There were public festivals and sacrifices designed to ensure a bountiful harvest. The Vestal Virgins, the most sacred priestesses in Rome, were responsible for preparing a special salt cake called the *molla salsa, which was used in public sacrifices. This cake, made from the first grain of the harvest, symbolized the relationship between the gods, the Roman state, and the food supply of the people. A failed harvest wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a sign that the gods were angry, that the sacred contract between Rome and its deities had been broken. Food was not just physical nourishment, it was a religious and political sacrament. And then there were the fast days. Throughout the Roman calendar, there were specific days dedicated to religious fasts, where meat was forbidden or eating was restricted. These fasts were a form of collective self-discipline, a way of demonstrating piety and communal solidarity. Fasting was another form of portion control, but one that was voluntary and imbued with religious significance. It was a way of proving that the Roman citizen was master of his own body, that his physical desires could be subordinated to his spiritual duties and his civic responsibilities. It was a demonstration that the Roman will, collective and individual, was stronger than the biological demands of the stomach. For the enslaved population, which made up a huge percentage of the Roman world, eating was a form of management by their owners. A Roman agricultural manual from the 2nd century BC, written by Cato the Elder, gives explicit instructions on how to feed slaves. For work in the fields, he recommends a specific quantity of bread for the winter months when the days are shorter, and a larger, specified quantity for the summer when the days are longer and the work is harder. The food was deliberately monotonous: bread, poles, a little wine, some olives, and a tiny bit of salt fish on major holidays. It was a diet calculated to provide the exact number of calories needed for maximal work output, with almost nothing left over. It was portion control as a form of cost management. You didn't want your slaves to be weak and sick, because sick slaves couldn't work. But you also didn't want them to be well-fed and strong, because well-fed, strong slaves might get ideas. They might become rebellious. The perfect slave diet was one that provided just enough energy for obedience and labor, but not enough for resistance. It was social engineering on a biological, metabolic level. The women of Rome, who were citizens but enjoyed far fewer legal rights than men, were also subject to a specific form of dietary control. While men ate to fuel public life and military service, women were often associated with the private, domestic sphere of food preparation. Their portions were generally smaller than men's, reflecting their presumed lesser need for physical energy. The ideal Roman woman was praised for her frugality and her skill at managing the household food supply. She was expected to be disciplined in her own eating, to deny herself for the good of her family, and to preside over the kitchen with an efficient, almost military precision. Excessive eating by a woman was seen as a moral failing, a sign of uncontrolled desire and feminine weakness. The portion on a woman's plate was a reflection of her subordinate social position and the cultural expectations of modesty, restraint, and domestic self-sacrifice. All of these different threads, the soldier's ration, the patrician's discipline, the plebeian's scarcity, the slave's controlled caloric intake, the woman's social restraint, were woven together into a single, coherent system. It was a system where food was never just food. It was a tool of state policy, a marker of social status, a reward for valor, a punishment for disobedience, and a sacrament of religious belief. The size of your morning portion was a public declaration of who you were, what your role was, and what the society expected from you. This massive, complex, almost invisible system of food distribution and social control was one of the most brilliant and overlooked achievements of the Roman state. It allowed them to maintain stability in a pre-industrial city of over 1 million people. It kept a professional army of several 100,000 men fed and loyal across millions of square miles of conquered territory. It managed a diverse population of citizens, foreigners, and slaves, keeping each group in its prescribed place. They did this without telephones, without trains, without refrigeration, without any of the modern tools of supply chain management. The Roman breakfast was the alpha and the omega of their day. It was the moment when the body was calibrated for the specific demands of the hours to come. It was the checkpoint where social status was confirmed, where discipline was administered, and where the vast, humming machine of the Roman Empire was set in motion. The ientaculum asterisk was more than a meal. It was a daily reenactment of the entire Roman social contract, a bowl of porridge that contained, in its dense, heavy substance, the entire weight of the Roman world. The big question, the one we've been building towards this entire time, is the most practical one of all. Could you do it? Could a modern person, with a modern body, raised on a modern diet and living in a modern world, actually eat a Roman breakfast and survive, let alone thrive, until dinner? Could you replicate this ancient system and see if it actually works as advertised? The answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no, but it's one of the most fascinating thought experiments you can undertake when you start looking at ancient history. It forces you to confront the profound differences not just in food, but in the very nature of our bodies, our lifestyles, and our fundamental relationship with the act of eating. First, let's get the modern science perspective on this. Let's look at this Roman meal through the lens of a nutritionist armed with a deep understanding of macronutrients, insulin response, and satiety hormones. The typical Roman breakfast we've described, a large bowl of pulse, made from whole, coarsely ground spelt, topped with olive oil, cheese, and maybe a little honey or garum asterisk, is actually a nutritional powerhouse by almost any modern standard. It's a meal that would make many modern dietitians nod their heads in approval. It's low in refined sugar, high in complex carbohydrates that have a low glycemic index, it contains a good balance of proteins and fats, and it's astronomically high in dietary fiber. That fiber is the real key. Modern research has shown that fiber is one of the most powerful tools for regulating appetite and ensuring long-term satiety. Soluble fiber, the kind found in abundance in spelt, oats, and barley, forms a gel-like substance in your digestive tract. This gel slows down the rate at which your stomach empties, which means the energy from your food is released over a long, steady period. It prevents the sharp spike in blood sugar that you get after eating a modern, sugary breakfast cereal, followed by the inevitable crash that leaves you ravenously hungry 2 hours later. A Roman breakfast was designed, whether they knew the science or not, to maintain stable blood sugar levels for an extended period of time. From a purely biochemical perspective, the Roman breakfast is a brilliant tool for appetite control. The macronutrient balance is also surprisingly modern. The combination of complex carbohydrates, proteins from cheese or eggs, and healthy fats from olive oil is exactly the combination that modern nutritionists recommend for a meal that is both satisfying and sustaining. The protein helps to build and repair muscle, and it also triggers the release of hormones in the gut that tell your brain you are full. The fats add flavor, make the meal more palatable, and provide a dense source of slow-burning energy. It's a meal engineered for endurance, for focus, and for preventing the distracting gnaw of hunger for a significant portion of the day. So, in theory, yes, the science absolutely supports the idea that this kind of meal could get you through to dinner. But this is where we have to introduce the complications, the real-world factors that a simple nutritional analysis can't quite capture. The first and most obvious factor is physical activity. The Roman world was a world of relentless, grinding, physical labor. It was a world without engines, without electric motors. If you wanted something heavy moved, you moved it yourself, or you used an animal. If you wanted to travel, you walked. If you were a soldier, you marched for 20 miles in a day with an 80-pound pack on your back. If you were a farmer, you spent 12 hours bent over in a field under the hot Italian sun. If you were a builder, you were hauling massive blocks of stone. This level of daily physical output is almost incomprehensible to the average person living in the 21st century. A modern office worker sits in a chair for 8 hours a day. The most physically demanding thing they might do is walk to their car. Our bodies have adapted to a sedentary lifestyle. Our metabolisms are slower, our muscle mass is lower, our energy needs are fundamentally different. A modern person eating a massive, 1,000-calorie Roman breakfast and then sitting at a desk would not be burning that energy off. Instead, their body would store it. The result would be weight gain, sluggishness, and probably a significant amount of gastrointestinal discomfort from a volume of food and fiber that your body isn't used to processing. But let's imagine you're not a typical office worker. Let's imagine you're an athlete, a construction worker, or a hiker. You are expending that same level of physical energy that a Roman would have. In that case, the Roman breakfast becomes a much more viable, even attractive option. An endurance athlete who is about to run a marathon or cycle for 6 hours needs exactly what a Roman legionary needed: slow-burning, sustained energy. A construction worker hauling materials all day needs the dense caloric load that a bowl of pulls with cheese and oil can provide. For a highly active modern person, the Roman breakfast isn't just a viable option, it's a potentially brilliant one. The next major complication is the food itself. Can you even get pulls? Can you replicate it? The answer is yes, but not easily. You can buy spelt in some health food stores or online, but the modern spelt you find is often different from the ancient varieties the Romans used. It's been cultivated and changed over 2,000 years. The closest you can probably get is to use emmer wheat, also known as farro, which is more widely available. You would need to coarsely grind it yourself, because the fine, processed flour you buy at the supermarket has had most of the fiber and nutritional content stripped out. This is a crucial step. The magic of pulse was in its coarse, gritty texture. So, step 1 in our experiment is to find and grind your own ancient grains. Then there are the other ingredients. Good, strong, first press extra virgin olive oil is easy enough to find. But what about *garam*? You can buy modern Asian fish sauces, like Thai Nam Pla or Vietnamese Nuoc Mam. These are made in a similar way to Roman *garam*, and they will give you a sense of that powerful, salty, umami kick. But they are not exactly the same, and they are often less concentrated. And what about Roman cheese? A good, hard, salty pecorino romano is probably the closest modern equivalent. So, with some hunting and preparation, you can assemble a rough approximation of a Roman breakfast. Now, let's talk about adaptation. Your body is not a Roman body. You have a completely different microbiome, the universe of bacteria that lives in your gut and helps you digest food. The modern diet, high in processed foods, antibiotics, and low in fiber, has radically altered the gut health of most people. You are simply not equipped to handle the sheer volume of fiber that a Roman would have eaten without complaint. If you were to suddenly switch from a modern breakfast of sugary cereal or toast to a massive bowl of whole grain pulse, the results would be, to put it mildly, dramatic. You would experience bloating, gas, and a level of digestive activity that would make you deeply unpopular in any quiet office environment. But here's the interesting thing. If you were to do it gradually, if you were to slowly introduce more whole grains into your diet over a period of weeks, allowing your gut bacteria to adapt and change, your body would begin to change. It's called gut microbiome adaptation. You would develop the bacteria needed to efficiently break down all that fiber. You would start to feel fuller for longer on less food. Your digestion would become more regular. Many of the common digestive complaints of the modern world, like constipation and irritable bowel syndrome, might start to resolve themselves. This is exactly what the Roman system was designed to do. They didn't start eating this way at age 30. They were raised on it from infancy. Their bodies were adapted to it from the very beginning. There's also the factor of acquired taste. The Roman palate was a trained palate. It was used to intense, powerful, and to our modern tastes, often bizarre flavors. The combination of sweet honey, sharp vinegar, salty cheese, and savory *garam* is not something most of us are born liking. We have been conditioned by decades of advertising and food science to crave sweetness above all else. Our palates are numb to subtlety. The Roman breakfast would taste alien at first. It would be a challenge. But taste, like the gut microbiome, is adaptable. If you were to eat this way consistently for a month, your palate would begin to change. You would start to appreciate the sharp contrast of a briny olive, the depth of a good fish sauce, the earthy complexity of a whole grain. You would find modern breakfasts, with their one-note sweetness, to be bland and unsatisfying. It would be a process of culinary education. The most powerful evidence for the effectiveness of the Roman system is its close cousin, the modern Mediterranean diet. For decades, scientists have been studying the diet of people living in the regions that were once part of the Roman Empire. And what they've found is remarkable. The Mediterranean diet, which is high in whole grains, olive oil, fish, vegetables, and legumes, and low in processed foods and refined sugar, is consistently shown to be one of the healthiest in the world. People who eat this way have lower rates of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and certain types of cancer. They live longer, healthier lives. It's no coincidence that this diet, which is the direct cultural and culinary descendant of the Roman way of eating, shares the same core principles: whole foods, healthy fats, plenty of fiber, and a focus on long-term satiety over immediate gratification. The Roman breakfast is, in many ways, just a concentrated form of the Mediterranean diet. It contains all the essential components that make the modern diet so healthy. It's also worth noting that in many parts of the Mediterranean world, the tradition of a large, starchy lunch followed by a lighter evening meal still persists. The rhythm may have shifted, but the logic is the same: front-load your day with calories and energy, so that the last meal can be a smaller, less disruptive affair before you rest. So, could you actually eat a Roman breakfast and survive until dinner? The answer, for most people, is a qualified yes. If you are physically active, if you take the time to find and prepare the proper ingredients, if you allow your body and your palate a few weeks to adapt, and if you approach it not as a fad diet but as a complete lifestyle change, then yes, absolutely. You would likely find that you feel fuller, more energetic, and more mentally focused than you do on a modern, sugary breakfast. But the real lesson of the Roman breakfast isn't just in the food itself. It's in the philosophy. It's the idea that food is fuel, that breakfast is the most important strategic meal of the day, and that what you eat should be dictated by what you need to accomplish. It's the understanding that convenience and long-term health are often opposing forces. The Romans made a conscious choice to prioritize their physical and mental performance over the ease and speed of their morning meal. They invested time and energy into preparing food that would serve them well for the entire day. It may not have been Instagram-worthy or ready in 30 seconds, but it worked. And that, perhaps, is the most profound and challenging takeaway from this entire exploration. The Roman breakfast is a reminder that what we eat is a choice, and it's one of the most important choices we make every single day. Thank you for joining me tonight on this deep dive into the world of Roman breakfast. If this kind of exploration into the practical realities of ancient life is something you enjoy, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And let me know in the comments if you have any questions, or if you'd be brave enough to actually try a bowl of pulse for yourself. I've heard it's an interesting experience. Until next time.